All right, as promised, let's talk about defensible thesis statements. I pulled this meme because I think one of the things that drives Miss P and me super crazy as the year gets going are really, really vague rhetorical analysis thesis statements. So, I mean, obviously, I love cats, but I just thought this was a funny way of using that famous, the housewives of somebody, and this cat. So, we do not want to be vague with our defensible thesis statements. Okay, so let's talk about what AP wants. Now, thesis development is an entire category on your FRQ rubrics for all three of them. So you can get an entire point in one sentence, and that's awesome, okay? So what they are looking for, to get the point, is that you're responding to the prompt with a defensible thesis that may establish a line of reasoning. What would not earn the point is that there is no defensible thesis. The intended thesis only restates the prompt. The intended thesis provides only summary of the issue or text with no apparent or coherent claim, or there is a thesis, but it does not respond to the prompt. Okay? So our big no-nos are, one, that it's not defensible. So if we provide a really vague thesis statement where the purpose says something along the lines of, the author makes his argument by blah, blah, blah. That's so vague, and what I mean by defensible is no one can argue against that, okay? What makes a thesis defensible is that you've taken a side, you've taken a position, and with rhetorical analysis, your position is this is his purpose and these are his choices. So you need to have those pieces in there to make sure that it is defensible, okay? Now, I have a prompt written for you. The passage is attached to your Schoology assignment, but this is the one we're going to kind of use to look at some sample thesis statements. And let's read it. John Boyega, an actor best known for playing Finn in the new Star Wars installments, gave an impromptu speech during the George Floyd protests of police brutality in London on June 3rd, 2020. Read the passage carefully. Write an essay that analyzes the rhetorical choices Boyega makes to convey his argument that change is necessary and attainable through joint effort. So you'll notice I created this prompt right using the stable wording. I have my background information, John Boyega, the actor, obviously talking about the context, the protest of police brutality, the date, and all that. So take a second, pause the video, go ahead and read the passage. It is not very long, but it's really going to help give that context for our sample thesis statement. So I'll give you a minute here. All right, hopefully you paused and read it because it'll make a lot more sense if you did. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up 4 thesis statements and kind of talk about why it would get the thesis point or why it would not, okay? So this first one says, Boyega makes the argument that Black individuals need to fight racism. Think about that for a second. What criteria are we responsible for with a thesis statement? This particular one would not get the point. And the reason it's not going to get the point is because it's just summarizing. It's just kind of telling me what he's talking about. There's no mention of what his intention or purpose is. I mean, it does say to fight racism, but it's more just kind of summarizing what the speech is about, and there's no evidence of rhetorical choices. So this is an example of, in that criteria, they said that the thesis might just be summarizing the passage. This is a prime example of that. All right, thesis number 2. Boyega calls protesters to action through direct address and repetition. Think about it for a second. This one would get the thesis point. I do want to clarify, though, when it says Boyega calls protesters to action, that's still a little bit vague. I mean, it does say that he wants them to take some sort of action, particularly in the context of the protest. So it's definitely enough to get the point. I would just say that when we're writing for class, and just best practice would be to be even more specific. So you might say something like, Boyega calls protesters to fight racism and inequality through the direct address and repetition. Just a little bit more to be a little bit more specific. This would be an example of like a proficient thesis statement, but definitely not a mastery thesis statement. Thesis 3, Boyega develops his argument through direct address and repetition. So this one is very similar, but what we have an issue with for this one is that we have that super vague develops his argument phrase in there. While the previous one was only slightly more specific, this one offers nothing about what his argument is about, what he's trying to get. So it's really, really too vague to constitute an arguable or defensible thesis. So in our kind of context of standards-based grading, this would be like a partial proficient, meaning that there is a thesis there and it even has choices, but it's so vague that it's not really making a defensible argument. Which brings us to Thesis 4, which is by directly addressing his peers, the black men, and reiterating the importance of unity and longevity, Boyega empowers the disenfranchised black population to take action against racism. I think this one's pretty straightforward. Yes, it definitely gets the point, because we have the choices. 1, directly addressing his peers, and 2, reiterating the importance of unity and longevity. But we also have the purpose, which is to empower the disenfranchised population to take action. So it has all 3 pieces, but if you notice, it also crafts that thesis in a really artful way that it's hard to think of it as persuasive when we're talking about analytic writing, but this is something that when I read this, I can tell that the author truly understands that rhetorical situation quite well. So this is what I would call, and Ms. P would call, a mastery thesis statement, because it has that bigger picture awareness with things like the disenfranchisement, that's huge, unity and longevity, those big ideas, and how it fits this context. So definitely a good example of a thesis statement. So to recap, a defensible thesis statement needs to be specific. No defends his arguments or builds his arguments. Tell me what the argument is, okay? Arguable, that kind of goes with that specific thing, but also when we're talking about arguable, do those choices fit? Do I see them in the passage? Does it make sense for the rest of the paper that you're going to write, okay? And the third is that it's appropriate or it's on task. So an inappropriate thesis would be just summarizing what the passage is about, okay? When we're talking about appropriate with rhetorical analysis, we're talking about a thesis statement that, like I said, lines out the purpose and identifies those choices. So there is a handout for your next step. It has a prompt on it. What I'd like you to do is underline the task statement in that. So look for where it asks for it uses the stable wording about writing the essay, okay? And then on the same sheet, it's going to ask you to provide what's called a non-example and what's an example. So an example is a thesis statement that would receive the point, but I want you to show me that you understand by giving me an example that wouldn't get the point. And then there's a place for you to explain those. So that is your practice. Good luck, and I'll speak to you soon.